If you look at the history of tank design, it's usually a story of more. More armor, more firepower, and more tracks. We've seen tanks with 2 barrels, tanks the size of houses, and tanks that can swim. But in the mid-1930s, the British military looked at a trench and asked a question that sounded like a joke. What if we just jumped over it? This is the Wallace Leaping Tank. It wasn't a joke, and it wasn't a toy. It was a serious engineering project spearheaded by P.C. Wallace to solve the one problem that had haunted the British Army since the mud of the Somme: static defenses. While the rest of the world was figuring out how to make tracks wider, Wallace was building a mechanical leg designed to kick the earth so hard that a multi-ton tank would take flight. In this video, we're looking at the origin, the insane physics, and the real reason why the Pogo tank never made it to the front lines. To understand the Wallace mechanism, you have to stop thinking of it as a vehicle and start thinking of it as a massive, armored pile driver. The entire system relied on a concept called mechanical energy storage. The problem Wallace faced was that a 1930s engine, specifically the 40 horsepower unit found in the Carden Lloyd, simply didn't have the burst power to lift 3,000 pounds of steel into the air instantly. To fix this, he had to find a way to bank the engine's power over several seconds and then release it in one violent explosion of movement. The centerpiece of this was a massive rear-mounted trailing arm, often called the leg. This wasn't just a simple metal pole, it was a heavy-duty, reinforced steel girder designed to survive thousands of pounds of pressure without snapping. At the end of this leg was a wide, flat foot. This foot was essential because if it were too small, the leg would simply punch a hole in the ground like a needle, wasting all that energy instead of pushing the tank upward. The brain of the jump was located in a specialized secondary gearbox. When the driver approached an obstacle, they would shift a lever to engage a heavy internal flywheel. As the tank drove forward, the engine would spin this flywheel faster and faster, storing up kinetic energy like a wind-up toy. Connected to this flywheel was a series of cams, egg-shaped gears designed to convert spinning motion into a sudden, powerful kick. As the tank reached the wall, the driver triggered the release. The cam would rotate, slamming the trailing arm into the dirt with enough force to launch the entire vehicle. Because the leg was at the back, the tank would naturally tilt its nose up first, allowing the front of the tracks to clear the top of the obstacle while the rest of the chassis followed in an arc. However, the physics of the landing were just as complex as the launch. To keep the tank from flipping over backward or nose-diving into the mud, the kick had to be perfectly timed with the tank's forward speed. If the tank was moving too slow, it would just hop straight up and land on its own tracks, likely shattering the suspension. If it was too fast, the force of the jump would cause the tank to tumble. To manage the violence of the movement, Wallace even experimented with compressed air cylinders that acted as giant shock absorbers. These were meant to catch the leg after it fired, preventing it from bouncing back and smashing into the tank's own floorboards, all built to make a hunk of British iron defy gravity for a few terrifying seconds. Despite the engineering brilliance, the Wallace Leaping Tank eventually hit a wall that no amount of jumping could clear: the reality of the human body and the evolution of the battlefield. By 1937, the trials at the Mechanization Experimental Establishment, MEE, had painted a grim picture. The most immediate problem was the spine cracker effect. While Wallace could reinforce the steel frame of the Carden Lloyd with extra welds and gussets, he couldn't reinforce the human skeleton. In a standard tank, the suspension handles the vibrations of the road. In the Wallace tank, the suspension had to handle a 3-ton impact from a height of several feet. The deceleration force, the G load, at the moment of landing was high enough to cause concussions, internal bruising, and even vertebral compression for the crew. Even if the tank survived the jump, the driver would often be too dazed to actually continue the mission. You simply cannot build an army out of men who are incapacitated every time they cross a fence. Then there was the tactical vulnerability. We often think of high ground as an advantage, but in tank warfare, visibility is a death sentence. The moment the Wallace tank vaulted into the sky, it broke hull-down cover. For 3 to 5 seconds, it became a silhouette against the skyline. In the mid-30s, anti-tank rifles and high-velocity 2-pounder guns were becoming standard. A jumping tank is a ballistic target. Once it's in the air, it cannot steer or change its trajectory. It follows a predictable arc that an enemy gunner could track with ease. Furthermore, the belly of a tank is its weakest point. By jumping, Wallace was essentially showing the enemy the tank's softest, most vulnerable underside. Finally, we have to look at the competition. The British Army eventually realized that the obstacle problem didn't require a flying tank. It required a smarter tank. This era saw the development of the Scissors Bridge and the Arc tanks. These were vehicles that didn't jump. They carried a bridge on their back, laid it over the trench, and allowed the entire platoon to drive across safely. It was a boring solution compared to a leaping tank, but it was reliable, it didn't break the driver's back, and it worked every single time. By the time the clouds of World War II were truly gathering, the War Office had seen enough. The Wallace Leaping Tank was a fascinating experiment in extreme engineering, but in the cold light of military necessity, it was a pogo stick in a world that needed a bridge. The project was quietly shelved, and the sole prototype likely met its end in a scrap heap, leaving us with only the legend of the tank that tried to fly. The Wallace Leaping Tank is a perfect reminder that the path to the high-tech machinery we see today isn't a straight line. It's a road paved with weird, wonderful, and occasionally airborne failures. In the 1930s, the rules of tank warfare hadn't been written in stone yet. Before we settled on the standard formula of heavy tracks and thick armor, there was a brief, chaotic window where engineers genuinely believed a tank should behave more like a grasshopper than a bulldozer. Ultimately, the project collapsed because physics and biology simply wouldn't cooperate. No matter how much steel Wallace added to the frame, he couldn't protect the crew's spines from the brutal G-forces of the landing. Combine that with the fact that a jumping tank was a sitting duck for anti-tank gunners, and the War Office had seen enough. By the late 1930s, the British Army officially shelved the project in favor of more practical solutions like bridge layers. If you're hoping to see this mechanical pogo stick in person today, you're out of luck. Unlike many other experimental oddities from the era, the Wallace prototype didn't make it to a museum. It was likely scrapped shortly after the trials ended, leaving us with nothing but a few grainy photos and a legendary "what if" in the archives of military history.